Then, as you know, William, it was something very interesting in an interview I read some years ago, particularly as a brilliant art maker as you are. They're the two different sides of, we all at least do it even if we don't make art, but we're interested in art. One thinks about art. And then you said something very interesting, that you'd not thought about or had made anything, let's say it was at age 5 or 6, but largely because of your parents' friends. In this case, you mentioned Nadine Gordimer and David Goldblatt. You said how, obviously you really like David Goldblatt as a person too, but so the first time you started thinking about images, or where images started to catalyze thought processes. If you maybe just talk a little bit about that.
I'd been drawing for a while at the Art Foundation afterwards, and then I was asked to do a long interview with David Goldblatt for a documentary that was being made on his work. So I'd known his work, but it was only then I did the detailed looking with him, going through prints and talking. And I'd not drawn landscapes at that point. They'd all been interiors or people or the domestic scenes. And I was very struck by one of the things he said was looking at some of the photographs he'd taken in the Bushveld or in the Karoo. And he said how much he loved what he termed these fuck-all landscapes. And I thought, okay, a landscape can be a fuck-all landscape. Okay, I can deal with that. And it kind of opened up a whole possibility. Instead of saying a landscape needs to be the Western Cape, it needs oak trees, it needs rivers, it needs shade, it needs a kind of Tinus de Jong or the whole South African traditional Pierre Neef, the whole tradition of that landscape. One can rather enjoy what it is not, all the parts that's not there. So certainly my sense of seeing Johannesburg and the area around Johannesburg was very much shaped through looking at primarily David Goldblatt's photographs, but then many other photographers. Also, there's also something fantastic about them already meeting me halfway. They were black and white, so they met charcoal drawing halfway, they met etching halfway. They already said, we're not looking at the world, we're looking at some abstracted different version of the world from which we infer an image of the world inside ourselves, or an understanding of it. This particular photograph of David's, which is some abandoned mind working, I loved particularly because it reminded me of a Piranesi etching of a huge wheel in one of his 17th century etchings of the prisons of his Carceri series. So those links where an image takes you back, a bit like the trees and trial. It may be a false association, but it's to say, give the association the benefit of the doubt. See where it leads you. See what you learn from the false association.
And then, William, was still on this slide. There was this very interesting thing, I think, in six drawing lessons, and something your dad, I think, was involved with legally, where you become so famous, particularly in your animation work, not just for the drawing, but more importantly for the erasure process. And then you talked about Johannesburg is probably the most fabulous city in the world, in the sense of it's also very sad how it erases itself in its own history. And then one of the sort of pertinent physical, so it's a metaphor, but the physical sort of attributes that have completely disappeared are our mountains. When we were kids, our mine dumps. And then maybe you can just talk about this difference between fixed and movable assets.
So those of you below a certain age won't remember the city surrounded by the yellow mine dumps, and those of you closer to my age, or 20 years younger, will remember there were many, many mine dumps around. And there was ongoing projects with what kind of grass could grow on the cyanide-filled sand, and there always seemed to be, I think once or twice, people had been swallowed by earth cleavages in them, so they were always seen as extremely dangerous places where children should never go onto those mine dumps. Now, when I started doing animation and working a lot with erasure, there's a sense in which cities, obviously one's used to buildings being removed and new buildings being put up, but what is much more unusual is for the hills, which are part of the geography of a city, to come and go. And this started happening, I think, in the late 70s, when the price of gold reached a certain point where it was worthwhile to try to leach out the last 0.001% of gold that had been left by the refining process in the mine dumps, but which could now be recovered with new metallurgical techniques. And so one by one the mine dumps started going, and there was a I remember one of my father's cases, not a political case, a commercial case, had to do with who owned the mine dumps. Were they fixed property? In other words, they grew there, they lived there. If you owned that physical land, you owned the mine dump. Or were they a movable asset that happens at the moment to be stationed on that piece of land, but could be taken away by the mine that had put it there? And I think while this was going on, making its way through the courts, a large number of mine dumps were simply melted away with high-pressure hoses and pumped out, making it kind of redundant, that question. But I'm sure there are still a lot of legal questions as to who owned the mine dumps. Not yet the question of who is responsible for the damage to people's health that those mine dumps did historically, but that will come.
And then one more, because only one more slide to go, but just one more question now about the physicality of Johannesburg. It's architecture, as you all remember it at a particular time, whether we were 10 or 15, but now the CBD itself. What would be one thing that you really miss that's no longer there?
Oh, there are many.
Maybe the Colosseum.
I mean, it's more than that. I'm sure all of us here are aware of the kind of the city in some ways is collapsing. You know, driving in and out to Maboneng every day, it's kind of one's very aware of the infrastructure getting more and more precarious. It's kind of fantastic to be here in this club, right in the center of the city, as if the city was still the way it used to be, with the city hall and its evening concerts and you know, one has to remember that that era of the city hall concerts, of all the different things, were very much a white Johannesburg. It was, as we know, very restricted physically, who could be here, who could not be here. And you know, if this is the price Johannesburg has to pay for making it an open city, well, that's the price we're paying. But still, it's, I mean, I'm sure like all of us here who are still living in Johannesburg and haven't either emigrated to Cape Town or to further afield, it's such a pleasure when one sees a crane on the horizon. You think, oh my God, there's building still happening. There's building happening again. Particularly if it's somewhere in the old centre of the city. It's a sadness that the Johannesburg Art Gallery is in such a dire condition. That the sense of coming into town at night evokes such anxiety for so many of us. We still hang on to it in Maboneng, at the eastern edge of having evening performances and a lot of things that happen every evening. And if you come on the highway, it's actually not bad, or you can take an Uber. But for a lot of people, it does feel like driving through it, you know, running the gauntlet to actually make your way downtown. You know, we got through it this time. So there's a lot of regret and sadness about where the city is. I mean, the city is, as you know, it's only 130 years old. Some of us have been here for almost half its lifetime. If you're in Rome, I mean, it's been there for those thousands of years. You've been there for a pinprick of time in its existence.
So I've obviously chosen this on purpose, William, because it's this idea which you've touched on a number of times of like these very early family experiences, but also sometimes these histories that you're not part of. So particularly your grandfather on the beach in 1933 in Muizenberg, but so many years later, and at that time in 2003, I'm not thinking it out quickly, but you're almost, I think, 50 years old at that point. Along comes a film, a majestic, incredible film. They're all incredible, but I already put this, if there's sort of the podium, this has got to be like a medal. This has got to be a bronze or a gold or a silver. And Tide Table, and maybe if you can talk about it, but also the culmination of how so many generations of your family end up in a strange way converging in the making of this film, even though I know it was subliminal at the time.
The Tide Table is a film which is, I was interested in the idea of the beach and the character Soho, who goes through all all the films. And only when I got to, Soho's always dressed in a pinstripe suit, so in the beach he had to be in his pinstripe suit. Only really when I got to that image did I remember the photograph of my grandfather that we started with in his pinstripe in the suit. But the generational games that happen is, so this in a way is a version of my grandfather, but to do it I sat myself in a deck chair and took a photograph to use as the reference for it. And then there's this image of Soho thinking of himself as a child on the beach. So for the child of that, which is a bit like the image of my father sitting on the beach next to his grandfather as an 8-year-old in Musenberg, but as a model for that, I asked my son Sam, who was then about 8 or 10, I can't remember, to take some photographs of him as a reference. So there's a scene in which the old man skims a stone across the surface of the water, and I wanted the same action to be done by his younger self, his image of his younger self. The nanny on the beach for me was very much an image of the nanny who used to take my sister and I, Ellen Toller, used to take us to the beach. My parents would sleep in late when they were on holiday, and she would take us to the beach with a thermos of Oros and a peanut butter sandwich, and we'd wait on the beach until my parents arrived before we were allowed to get into the water, because she couldn't swim, Ellen couldn't swim. I remember my sister, who then must have been about 6, in what still rankles as a kind of, boy, what are the different phrases of entitled young white South Africans, was her shouting at this old woman, her nanny, at her, because she wouldn't let her swim, shouted at her, "You think you're the Prime Minister of the whole world." And you think, what could be further away from sort of someone who worked as a childminder like it. So we had myself playing my grandfather, but my son playing my father, but those generations in. The only thing that gave it away is that I am right-handed, and my son is left-handed. You can see he's throwing the stone with his left-handed, but that was kind of like a detail noticed by people watching the film 5 times. But it is there, it stays there as a kind of a deep reference of him having been in the film.
William, am I right, last thing to say, that at the time, this was all subconscious, the time that you're drawing and filming, this is not frontally in your mind, you're not really even aware of this, it gets pointed out to you later, or you sort of see it later, all these layers of connection.
Yeah, the one that was stupid was not to recognize, as I drew the deck chair, oh, this is that old photograph. But once that was written, then all those other layers of generational history came into it. I mean, it's also a film about the AIDS pandemic, about thin cows, the Pharaoh's dream of thick cows and thin cows, drawings of an AIDS hospital in Malawi that comes into it. Generals from Zimbabwe looking through binoculars. Whatever's in the news gets into the films as they're being made. And that was part of it.
Thank you. Obviously, just with thinking about time constraints, try to bring in some art. It was largely more, as you've heard, William's 4 generations of family in Johannesburg and those recollections, but we obviously want to open to questions from the floor, just if any questions you might have for William.
Yeah. You're a visual artist.
Yes.
So I'm just curious, do you feel that you could have been a literary artist or a sculptor?
No, so I mean, sculptor, yes, which is a visual thing. I'm so not a writer, so there's a lot of writing in what I do, but it is all kind of found writing, cutting up other people's, other poets, other lines. I'm so not a novelist. That's why when you're writing a sentence, you just write a random sentence. It's very hard to put those random sentences into something coherent. If you're making a drawing or the animation, you can have these different fragments and then see what happens if you put them next to it and allow. So it's a different kind of clarity. There's an unclarity which is possible in the visual arts, which is much harder in a literary art. So I would love it. I would love it if I could have written poetry rather than be a poet necessarily, but I have to do it as a second-hand remove.